Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now it would be unfair to call this a GTX 850M test as this laptop's processor holds the GPU back the majority of the time. Usually it's the other way around. Most gaming laptops I've tested from say 5 or so years ago are still doing fine as far as the CPU is concerned, but they are let down by the non-upgradable graphics chip. The dual-core i5 4210M found inside this custom machine is still okay, but it is definitely the limiting factor. That's why I'll call this video the cheap 850M laptop 2021 test or something similar, instead of just the GTX 850M test, as I'm certain that the 850 has a little more to give than what you're going to see today. The thing is though, if you are shopping for a used gaming laptop and you're on a tighter budget, then it won't be uncommon for you to come across a lot of similar spec machines, so I think that this thing is still representative of what can largely be found at a certain price point. So let's get into some games. Luckily this laptop has a screen resolution of 900p, which is going to work in our favour. We're starting off with Overwatch here, and I used the low graphical preset with native 100% scaling. Now despite the CPU, which is probably going to be, as I said before, the bottleneck in most of today's games, Overwatch actually ran fairly well. Very well in fact, considering the specifications. So I said that the CPU is holding us back, but it does make me wonder if I were to upgrade this thing to say an i7 on the same socket, how much of an improvement would we actually see? Because the 850M would actually become the bottleneck in that scenario, because after all it is a pretty weak GPU in 2021, all things considered. That said, it does have 2 gigs of GDDR5 VRAM, unlike some other 850Ms which commonly have 2 gigs of DDR3, or so I've read. Overwatch then, well, it's a pretty good start here, and I've got to be honest, I wasn't expecting a plus 60 FPS average at any setting. So we're going to dive into The Witcher 3 now. As usual, the deceiving graphical menu is up first. I say deceiving because here we're seeing over 300 FPS, but as soon as we jump into the game after setting the graphical and post-processing settings too low, then the frame rate is of course going to drop. So here we are just outside Novigrad here. As you can see, things are remaining fairly stable. If you take a look at the frame time graph under the statistics in the top left corner, then we're seeing about 40 to 50 FPS. Once again, both the CPU and GPU are actually fairly evenly matched in this case. Both are maxing out at 99, 100% usage. The laptop also has 8 gigs of RAM, albeit in single channel as well. This can be upgraded to 16 gigs, but again, if we were to do that, I'm not sure how much more frames we'd actually get because of the graphics chip, which itself cannot be changed. So running around Novigrad now, and we're still seeing above 30 FPS. The game still looks fairly decent with the low settings, and for the most part it is a playable experience, though you can expect some stutters here and there, especially when there are more NPCs on screen because of the weaker CPU. So let's jump into GTA 5. Again, we'll use the 900p native resolution here. Now I left a couple of these sliders more than minimum. Population density and scaling were set a few clicks to the right. Everything else was pretty much on normal. Switching to high textures uses much more VRAM, so I decided to remain with normal there as well. Actually jumping into the game then, and well, again it was a pretty surprising result. The overall FPS wasn't too bad, though you will see some dips towards 30 in those more intensive situations, and once again the CPU is the limiting factor. The GPU is only being utilised at about 40 to 50% a lot of the time, so yeah, whereas the CPU is sitting at 90 to 100. GTA 5 though these days, well, it tends to run on a wide variety of hardware because it honestly isn't all that demanding at all. It used to be far more CPU demanding back in the day, and running this on this processor 3 or 4 years ago would have incurred a lot more stutters, I think. But thankfully, problems like that have been ironed out with updates. Okay, so this is going to be a mistake. Cyberpunk 2077. I chose all low settings here, which was probably obvious, including the texture quality and crowd density, because, well, we're going to need the lowest settings we can possibly get here, to be honest. Though, having said that, I did try and leave everything on 900p at first. If we start off in the countryside then, and well, the frame rate wasn't terrible. It was pretty bad, but it wasn't terrible. It was higher than I thought it would be. But to be honest, the stutters and frame dips here do make this a pretty unplayable experience. It was at this point then, I thought we may as well set the scaling or the resolution scaling down a little bit. I used the static resolution scaling and set it down to 70% in the hopes of a smoother frame rate. This actually worked to some degree. We were averaging 30 according to the on-screen figures, although take this with a pinch of salt because while we may be seeing 30 on average, the terrible frame dips and percentile figures do make this an overall pretty bad gaming experience, but it is Cyberpunk, so it was to be expected. If we actually move on to the city now, you can see that the frame rate sort of stays around 20 to 30 a lot of the time. I think I spoke too soon there, but yeah, overall the average is 30 FPS, but it's not going to be a nice 30 FPS. Okay, so let's jump into Fortnite now. Once again, 1600 by 900p native resolution. We left the scaling at 100%, though I did switch to the performance mode API and chose the far view distance because this does allow you to see your enemies further away, which is always helpful in a competitive shooter like Fortnite here. Now, I did choose the standard DX11 API first of all, but this meant a much lower frame rate, and even so we were seeing some horrific stutters, mainly I think due to that CPU. I tried to look for an i7 to upgrade this thing, and I haven't been able to find one for a reasonable price at the moment, but I'll keep a constant eye out, and as soon as I can find one, well, I'll switch it into this system and see if we do see any significant upgrades, though, as I said, I think the GPU will become the bottleneck. Battlefield 5 is up next. I did try Call of Duty, the new one, Black Ops Cold War, but unfortunately it never got past the optimizing shaders stage. I don't understand why it has to do that every time because no other game really does that, does it? So yeah, it's a bit odd, but usually it takes its time with older hardware, but in the case of today it just would not load, and so the game was a stuttery mess. Battlefield 5 though, at the low settings, probably wasn't much better, though we were averaging at least 30 frames per second. Again, it's the stutter that made it unplayable, to be honest. If there wasn't so much stutter, which probably could be remedied with extra cores and threads, then all of these games would feel a lot smoother to play. Let's move on down here a little bit just to see how steady the frame rate actually holds. I think multiplayer is going to be out of the question here unless you really do turn down that resolution scaling, but then it's going to make your enemies a lot harder to see. Okay, so Watch Dogs Legion here ran a lot better than I thought as well. Of course, we did have to opt for 720p with the lowest in-game settings, but I did keep the resolution scaling or temporal upscaling at 100%, so we were running at native 720p. For the most part, the frame rate was okay on average, once again, but you are going to see quite a few dips here and there, thanks to the i5, which is still doing better than I thought it would these days, but overall, it is a problem. Okay, so finally I tried Red Dead Redemption 2, which again did better than I was anticipating, but it did feel quite stuttery. Now, the CPU usage wasn't too high here, to be honest. The 850M was actually the limiting factor. I've said before that Red Dead is far more GPU intensive, and as long as you've got 4 threads, then you should be okay, within limits, of course. Now here, we were experiencing some stutter, and I thought it would be a good idea to turn on VSync at half, so basically a locked 30 FPS, to try and make things seem smoother. But as soon as I did that, I went into the graphical options menu and I switched on VSync. The game just jammed, and yeah, here are the settings I was using. Pretty much everything on low, but as I say, I switched the VSync on, and then trying to get back into the game, things totally froze, and we were running at about 0 to 1 FPS, which isn't really ideal. As you can see here, this is pretty much as far as I got. The game just locked up. So when I jumped back into the game, full screen 720p, meant for some reason that it started to play in this little window here. The frame rate overall was a little smoother, I guess, but the average probably wasn't improved despite this little box instead of a full screen display. Apparently, according to the laptop, this is full screen 720p, but I don't really know what happened here. Overall then, the 850M is still holding up to some degree, but I think it's going to perform a little better with a more powerful CPU, a CPU that I'll keep an eye out for, because it'll be interesting to see just how big the difference is. But for now, if you're looking for a cheap laptop, you come across a dual-core, hyper-threaded i5 and 850M combo, well, you're going to be able to run games like Overwatch and GTA just fine, put it that way. If you enjoyed this one then, leave a like on it down below, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.